The thing about Hemlo is that it doesn't look like anything from the outside. That's my way of saying I had no reason to be suspicious when I pulled off the Trans-Canada and followed the access road in. Just spruce trees on both sides, a gravel surface that needed grading, and then the head frame rising up out of the tree line like it belonged there, which I guess it did. I'd seen a 100 head frames. You stop seeing them after a while. They're just the thing that tells you where the hole is. I was 3 weeks into a 6-week contract. Watts Mineral Services out of Sudbury had placed me, same as they'd placed me on 4 or 5 jobs before that, and the arrangement was simple enough. I'd map a newly blasted lateral drift on level 7, submit the survey data, collect my fee, and drive back south. 6 weeks, decent day rate, and I needed it. I'd had a gap between contracts that ran longer than I'd planned, and my savings had opinions about that, strong ones. So when Watts called, I said yes before they finished explaining the job. I should have asked why the permanent staff hadn't taken it themselves. That's not me making excuses, I just didn't ask. The HR file I reviewed before signing listed the refusal as a personal comfort dispute, which is one of those phrases that sounds like it means something until you try to figure out what. It wasn't a safety flag. It wasn't a formal objection with paperwork behind it. It was just the guys who worked there full-time had passed on this particular assignment, and someone had written it up in a way that gave me no grounds to push back even if I'd wanted to. I read it, thought that's vague, and signed anyway. The money was the money. Hemlo's a real mine, that's the other thing. Not some marginal operation running on optimism and borrowed equipment. It's been producing since the early 80s, and it's got the infrastructure to show for it. Proper headframe, cage system, ventilation, the works. I'd worked smaller operations where you felt the improvisation in every system, where you could tell somebody had made a decision based on what they had rather than what they needed. Hemlo wasn't like that. Everything looked maintained. Everything looked considered. That matters, or it mattered to me, because when a place looks like it knows what it's doing, you stop second-guessing the small things. You trust the systems. My drilling partner was a man named David Sandoval. He was already assigned when I arrived. I didn't choose him and he didn't choose me. We just got handed to each other the way you do on contract work. 41 years old, stocky, quiet in a way that wasn't unfriendly so much as just economical. He didn't waste words. I noticed that on the first day, and I didn't mind it. Underground, you're working mostly. You're not there to talk. He knew the mine. That was obvious. Not just the layout, the feel of it, the way it moved and settled, the sounds it made that were normal versus the sounds that meant something. That kind of knowledge takes years and you can't fake it. I respected it. I also noticed without quite thinking about it at the time that he never seemed entirely relaxed down there. Not jumpy, not nervous, just attentive in a way that went a little past professional. His eyes moved a lot. He'd go quiet in the middle of something and just listen for a second before continuing. I filed that under experienced minor habits and moved on. Day 4 was a Wednesday. We were on a lunch break, sitting on a couple of equipment cases, maybe 30 m back from the face we'd been working, and David was eating a sandwich with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything else. I was going through some notes on my tablet. The drift was coming along. Good blasting, clean walls, the kind of fresh rock that's actually pleasant to map because it hasn't had time to get complicated yet. David said without any particular lead-up that the previous surveyor had walked off the job after 2 weeks. I looked up. He was still eating. I asked what he meant. Walked off. He said the guy had paid the penalty and left. $4,000 out of pocket rather than finish the contract. Said it the way you'd mentioned that it had rained last Tuesday. Then he took another bite of his sandwich, and that was apparently the end of the information he intended to share. $4,000 is not a small number to walk away from. On top of the $4,000, you'd be eating the income you didn't earn on the back half of the contract, which depending on the rate could be another $8,000 or $10,000. That's not a decision you make because you're having a bad week. That's a decision you make because something has shifted in you and the money stopped being the most important thing. I sat there for a second trying to figure out if David was telling me this as a warning or just as a fact. His face didn't help. It never really did. I asked if he knew why. David said he didn't know. Said the guy had just stopped coming down. That was it. He finished his sand. Dwitch folded the wax paper, put it in his jacket pocket, and stood up. We went back to work. I kept thinking about it for maybe an hour after that, turning it over. $4,000, $2 weeks in, same as me, but there was nothing to attach the thought to. No incident, no complaint on record, nothing in the HR file that pointed anywhere. Just a number and a decision and a man who wasn't here anymore. Eventually, the work pulled my attention back and the thought went somewhere quieter. Not gone, but not loud either. Sitting in the back of my mind the way things do when they don't have enough shape yet to be a real concern. I was underground under contract and already 2 weeks behind whoever he was. That's not nothing now that I think about it. 2 weeks behind a man who decided $4,000 was worth less than getting out. I didn't know that yet. I mean, I knew the fact of it. I just didn't know what it meant. I kept working. Day 8 was when it started, or when I started noticing it. Anyway, hard to say which. We were deep in the lateral drift, maybe 200 m from the cage, running survey lines off the last blast zone. The rock face there was still raw. You could smell it. That sharp mineral bite that freshly broken granite gives off. Something between wet stone and struck flint. David was on the drill. I was logging coordinates, cross-checking against the previous day's markers. Nothing unusual, standard work. And then somewhere in the middle of it, between one breath and the next, I became aware of something sitting behind my sternum. Not pain, not pressure. The way a cough feels, or the way your chest tightens when you've been underground too long and you start thinking about how much rock is above you. This was lower than that, more like the feeling you get standing too close to a large speaker. Not the sound itself, but the fact of it, the physical fact, something your body registers before your ears do, a bass note, sustained, constant, not in the air around me, inside me, somewhere behind the breastbone, like a tuning fork held against the chest wall. I stopped what I was doing and stood there for a second. The drill was running. That was the obvious first answer. Drill vibration travels through the floor, through your boots, up through the body, and after enough hours of it, you stop consciously registering it, but it's still there. I've worked enough drill sites to know that your body absorbs it. So I told myself that's what it was and went back to the survey log, but I kept being aware of it. That's the thing. I kept noticing it the way you notice a sound that stops. Not when it was there, but in the moments when I expected it to stop, and it didn't. When David cut the drill for a water break, I stood in the sudden quiet and the sensation was still there. Same note, same depth, unchanged. Tinnitus was my next theory. I've had mild tinnitus since a bad blasting incident in Timmons. Nothing serious, just a faint high-pitched tone in the right ear that shows up when it's very quiet. This wasn't that. Different frequency, different location, not in the ear at all. But tinnitus is a broad category, and I'm not a doctor, so I filed it under body doing something weird and kept it there. The acoustics of freshly blasted rock were the third option. That one I actually half believed for a while. A newly opened tunnel changes the way sound moves through the surrounding stone. You get resonance effects, standing waves, harmonics that don't exist in older settled rock. I'd read about it, never experienced it personally, but the literature was there. Hemlo's geology is complex anyway, mixed metavolcanic and metasedimentary, which does strange things to vibration propagation. It was plausible, not certain, but plausible enough, so I kept working. That was the decision I kept making every time the sensation came up. Keep working. It wasn't stopping me from doing my job. It wasn't getting worse, not in those first days. It was just there. The way a low hum from a transformer is just there, and you learn to sort of bracket it off and operate around it. What I couldn't bracket off was day 11. We'd been running a long survey line, maybe 3 hours of continuous work, and David called a break. We did that, sat down against the tunnel wall, ate whatever we'd brought down, drank water, gave our backs a rest. Normal. I was going through my notes, checking a measurement I thought I'd transposed when I looked up, and David wasn't eating. He was standing at the rock wall about 4 meters from me, facing it. His left hand was pressed flat against the stone, not leaning, not bracing himself, just the palm placed flat and deliberate, fingers spread slightly. His eyes were closed. He was completely still. Not the stillness of a man resting, the stillness of a man paying attention to something. I watched him for maybe 30 seconds. He didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't scratch his face. Didn't do any of the small, unconscious things people do when Hey, or just standing somewhere, he was doing something specific. The hand placement was too intentional. The flatness of it, the spread fingers, the way his arm wasn't slack but wasn't tense either. Just present like he was taking a reading. I looked back at my notes. I don't know why I didn't say anything. Part of it was that I didn't know what to say. What are you doing felt too blunt, and I didn't have a softer version of it ready. Part of it was that David was a quiet guy by nature. Not unfriendly, but not someone who volunteered a lot. And I'd learned in the first week that he had his own rhythms, and mostly you let them run. Asking him to explain himself felt like it would cost something. Some small amount of the ease we'd built up, and I wasn't sure the answer was worth that yet, but I kept watching it happen. That's the part I keep coming back to now. It wasn't once. Over the next few days, it was every break, sometimes twice in a single break, always the same. Hand flat against the wall, eyes closed, that particular held stillness. Always the left hand, always a section of wall he'd been working near, not random placement. He'd finish, open his eyes, and go back to whatever he was doing without any transition, without any expression. And I could read like it was a normal thing, like he'd been doing it his whole life and didn't think about it any more than you think about checking your watch. I started noticing where he placed his hand relative to the survey markers. I'm not sure when I started doing that. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like my brain deciding on its own that the information might matter. He wasn't placing it on the same spot twice. He was moving along the wall, slightly different position each time. The way you'd move a stethoscope across someone's chest to listen to different chambers, the pressure in my sternum was still there. Steady 47 seconds I'd eventually figure out, but I didn't know that yet. On day 11, I just knew it was constant, and that David was pressing his hand against the wall during every break, and that neither of those things had a clean explanation. I thought about asking him what he was listening for. I thought about it more than once. The question sat in my mouth a couple of times. We'd be in the middle of a break, the silence between us easy enough, and I'd have the question right there. And then I'd let the moment pass because I think I already knew in some way I couldn't have articulated then that asking would make it real. That David would tell me something, and whatever he told me would change the shape of what we were doing down here. And the work still needed doing, and I needed the money, and it was easier to keep moving if I didn't stop to look at it directly, so I didn't ask. We worked. David pressed his hand to the wall during breaks, and I watched him do it, and neither of us said anything about it. The sensation in my chest stayed constant. The rock around us was the same rock it had always been, dark, close, smelling of blasting compound and mineral dust, and the particular underground cold that never fully goes away no matter how warm you dress. Everything was ordinary. That's what I kept telling myself. I kept working. Day 19 started like every other day underground starts, which is to say it started badly. 5:30 alarm, thermal layer, coveralls, steel toes. The walk from the bunkhouse to the muster building in the dark with your breath coming out in clouds and the gravel crunching under your boots and the mine's work lights making everything look the color of old teeth. You stop being precious about mornings pretty fast when you're on a contract like this. You just move. David wasn't at muster. That sounds simple. It wasn't. David was the kind of man who showed up in 19 days. I had never once beaten him to the muster board. He was always there when I arrived. Jacket already on, coffee already half gone, standing with the particular stillness he had, the one that looked like patience but was probably just how he was built. So when I came through the door and his name wasn't checked in, and his usual spot near the far wall was empty, I stood there for a second longer than I should have, just reading the room, making sure I hadn't miscounted the days, hadn't mixed up a shift schedule somewhere. Justin Juarez was standing near the front with a clipboard, which wasn't unusual. Ran the geological survey team, and he made a point of being visible at muster, which I'd always taken as management theater more than anything else. He was the kind of man who understood that being seen doing a thing was almost as good as doing the thing. I asked him where David was. Called in sick this morning, Justin said. Said it the way you'd say it about a stranger. Easy and uninvested stomach thing. I think he'll probably be back tomorrow. I said, okay. I didn't say anything else. We got our assignments. I was still on level 7, solo for the day, which was Phi. Knee in the practical sense and not fine in the other sense. The one I wasn't fully admitting to myself yet. I took my kit and went to work, and I did not think about David's empty spot at the muster board more than 4 or 5 times before noon. Lunch I spent underground, same as always, but when I came back up, I didn't go to the canteen. I went to the bunkhouse. I'm not sure what I was expecting to find. A made bed, maybe. The room looking the way a room looks when someone's sick. Water bottle on the nightstand, extra blanket, some evidence of a person trying to get comfortable. I think I just wanted to see it. Wanted to check the box in my head that said David is fine, David is sick. David called in sick and is sleeping it off, and everything makes sense. His bunk was made so tight you could have bounced a coin off it. I stood in the doorway for a moment. The bunkhouse smelled like boot rubber and the particular staleness of a room full of men who work physical jobs. Not unpleasant, just present. The way underground smells are present. His side of the room was neat. It was always neat, but the phone was on the shelf above the bed. His wallet was beside it, the old brown leather one I'd seen him pull out a dozen times at the canteen. And the photograph, the one he kept taped to the wall at eye level from the bed, a woman and two kids in front of what looked like a lake somewhere, that was still there, too. Exactly where it always was. A sick man leaving voluntarily takes his phone. That's not a complicated thought. That's not even a thought, really. It's just a fact. You're sick, you call in, you stay in your bunk, or you drive yourself to the clinic in town. And either way, your phone goes with you because your phone is how you tell people where you are. You take your wallet because you might need it. You take the photograph if you're leaving for good because you put it up in the first place because you wanted it near you. None of those things were gone. None of them had moved. I found Cadden Crane in the bunkhouse office, which was really just a repurposed storage room with a desk and a scheduling board. He managed the accommodations for the site workers, bed assignments, laundry rotation, that kind of thing. He was working through some kind of roster. When I knocked on the open door, I asked him if David had called in sick that morning. Cadden looked up. He had that particular blankness of someone who isn't sure whether the question is complicated or not. Sandoval, he said. No, nobody called in from his room this morning. I'd have a note. He turned to check the board anyway, the way thorough people do, even when they're already sure. Nothing here. I thanked him and left. Polly Collins had her office in the safety building, which was a portable unit bolted to a concrete pad between the equipment storage and the main shaft building. She was professional about it, took down everything I said, repeated it back to confirm she had the details right, explained the process in the clear and slightly formal way people use when they want you to know the process is real and will be followed. She filed the report. She gave me a copy. She said she'd escalate it through site management. I knew what escalate through site management meant. It meant Justin. He reassigned me to level 6 that afternoon, sent the notification through the site system. No conversation, just a schedule change that appeared on my tablet while I was still sitting in the safety building. Level 6 solo survey work effective immediately. I stared at it for a moment, then I went and did it. The thing about level 6 is that it's ordinary. That's the only way I know how to put it. The pressure I'd been carrying in my chest for 11 days wasn't there. The rock sounded like rock. The drill vibration was just drill vibration. I worked through the afternoon in the specific relief of a man who has been holding his breath and finally stopped. And I hated how good it felt because it meant the difference between the two levels was real, and I'd been telling myself it wasn't. Justin's invitation came through the site messaging system around 4:30. Stop by the office when you're done, just a check-in, nothing formal. There was a coffee cup emoji at the end of it, which I found difficult to look at directly. His office was on the surface in the main admin building, the kind of room that gets decorated just enough to signal that the person in it has tenure. A plant in the corner that was actually alive, a framed site map on the wall. He had a coffee maker on the credenza behind his desk, a real one, not the industrial urn from the canteen. And he poured 2 cups without asking how I took mine, which told me he'd either been watching or had guessed correctly. Sit down, Edwin, he said. You've had a long day. I sat. The chair was comfortable. I noticed that. He asked if I'd been sleeping well. Said it the way a doctor says it, not conversationally with a slight forward lean, like the answer mattered for a reason he wasn't stating. I said I was sleeping fine. He asked about headaches, any pressure behind the eyes, anything like that. I said no. He asked about chest pressure, whether I'd noticed anything, any sensation that didn't seem to match the work I was doing. He used the phrase, doesn't quite fit the environment, which was careful phrasing, the kind of phrasing you use when you've said the same thing enough times to have refined it. Then he asked whether I'd felt drawn toward any particular section of the mind, whether any area felt more. He paused, chose a word significant others. I looked at him across the desk. He had his coffee cup in both hands, and his expression was the expression of a man doing routine administrative work, patient and mildly attentive, giving nothing. I told him level 6 felt fine. I told him I hadn't had any headaches. I told him I was sleeping well and feeling good and appreciated him checking in. He nodded. He called it a routine wellness check, said the site had a protocol for solo workers, said he just wanted to make sure I had everything I needed. He said David's absence had put extra pressure on the schedule and he wanted to be sure I wasn't running myself down. I said I understood. What I understood was that he had just asked me in sequence and without hesitation about sleep disruption, about headaches, about pressure in the chest, and about whether I felt pulled toward a specific location underground. That is not a wellness form. I have seen wellness forms. I have filled out wellness forms on 4 different contracts in 3 different provinces, and none of them have ever asked whether you feel drawn toward a particular section of the mind. He knew exactly what symptoms to look for. He knew what order they came in. He had asked with the fluency of someone who had run through the list enough times that it no longer felt like a list to him. It felt like conversation. I finished my coffee. I thanked him for his time. I walked back to the bunkhouse in the dark and sat on the edge of my bunk for a while without turning the light on. David's room was down the hall. His phone was still on the shelf. His wallet was still beside it. I sat in the dark and I thought about what kind of man knows exactly which questions to ask. The tablet was a personal one, not my issue. I'd brought it from Sudbury in my kit bag along with my own calibrated inclinometer and a set of survey templates I'd been refining for about 3 years because mine issued equipment is fine until it isn't, and I'd learned that lesson twice already. The tablet had the GSC's public monitoring software loaded on it. The kind of thing you can pull from their website if you know it exists, which most people don't unless they've spent time on a geological survey contract. It could read any automated seismic array that broadcast on standard frequency. The Level 7 array broadcast on standard frequency. I'd known that since day 2 and hadn't thought much about it until I was sitting in the Level 6 lunch alcove on day 33, eating a sandwich I didn't really taste. Thinking about Justin Juarez's symptom inventory and David's phone still sitting on that shelf. I pulled the seismic archive. 3 weeks of readings logged every 4 minutes, stored in the array's onboard buffer. It took about 90 seconds to download. I set the sandwich down. The first thing I noticed was the cycle. You look at 3 weeks of seismic data and you expect noise, geological settling, equipment vibration, the general low-frequency chatter of a working mine. You expect variation. What you do not expect is a repeating interval so clean it looks like something a person drew with a ruler. 47 seconds of elevated subsurface resonance, then a gap, then 47 seconds again, over and over. I scrolled back through the archive and it was there on day 1 and it was there on day 21, and it was exactly the same both times, not approximately. Exactly. I sat with that for a minute. My first thought was mechanical. Some piece of equipment running on a fixed timer, a pump, or a ventilation cycle, but the gaps between cycles weren't consistent. Sometimes a few minutes, sometimes a few hours. The cycle itself was always 47 seconds. The spacing between cycles wasn't. I pulled the personnel entry logs for Level 7 on a separate screen. They're kept automatically. Every time someone badges through the Level 7 gate, the timestamp goes into the system. I lined them up against the seismic archive and started comparing. The cycle started 90 seconds after someone entered the drift tunnel. Every time, not sometimes, every time. Without a single exception across 3 weeks of data, and it stopped 90 seconds after that person left. I put the tablet face down on the table. Then I picked it back up. I went through it again because I'd made errors before and I didn't want this to be one of those times where I convinced myself of something because I wanted it to be true. I checked the timestamps against the entry logs 3 separate times, cross-referencing manually, and the pattern held. 90 seconds after entry, the cycle began. 90 seconds after exit, it stopped. The 47-second interval never changed. Whatever was generating that resonance, it knew when someone was in the tunnel. That's my way of saying it responded to presence. I don't have a cleaner way to put it. Then I pulled the personnel history going back 2 years, which took longer because it wasn't in the same database. I had to request it through the mine's internal records portal and wait about 4 minutes for it to compile. I ate the rest of my sandwich while I waited, mechanical habit. I don't think I tasted any of it. The personnel history showed me who had logged level 7 entries and how many. I sorted by frequency. Then I started checking names against the transfer records and the quit logs in the incident database, which is a separate system that I had access to because my contract classification included hazard assessment privileges. Another thing Justin probably hadn't checked carefully when he looked at my file, or maybe he had and it hadn't concerned him. Either way, I had it. Every worker who had logged more than 4 level 7 entries in any TUI window had left the mine. Some had filed for voluntary transfer, some had walked off without notice. 2 names from 2019, a driller named Petrov and a ventilation tech whose last name I couldn't read clearly because the scan was bad, appeared in the incident database with the same notation. Location unknown at time of shift end. That notation had a follow-up field. Both follow-up fields were blank. I set the tablet down again and looked at the wall of the alcove for a while. There was a safety poster on it about proper PPE for blasting operations. I read it twice without retaining anything. 6 entries. I had logged 6 level 7 entries in 11 days. I counted back through my own badge timestamps to make sure. Day 22, day 24, day 25, day 27, day 30, day 32, 6 entries. The threshold was 4 entries in 2 weeks. I had cleared that threshold on day 27 and hadn't known there was a threshold to clear. I thought about the previous surveyor who'd paid $4,000 out of pocket to break his contract. I thought about David pressing his hand flat against the tunnel wall, eyes closed, perfectly still. I thought about Justin asking me with practiced fluency whether I felt drawn toward any particular section of the mine. I thought about the 2 blank follow-up fields. I went to Justin's office that evening with the seismic printout folded in my jacket pocket. I hadn't decided exactly what I was going to say. I decided I was going to say something and see what he did with it. He was at his desk when I knocked. He waved me in without looking up, finished whatever he was writing, then leaned back in his chair and looked at me the way people look at something they were expecting. I put the printout on his desk. I told him what I'd found. The 47-second cycle, the 90-second response window, the personnel pattern. I laid it out plainly because I wanted to watch his face while I did it, and I didn't want to give him room to interrupt. He didn't deny it. He didn't look surprised. He picked up the printout, looked at it for a few seconds, not long enough to actually read it, just long enough to confirm it was what I'd said it was, and set it back down. He told me the Geological Survey of Canada's Thunder Bay office had reviewed the level 7 readings in 2020. He told me they'd classified the resonance as biologically inert subsurface acoustic resonance. I nodded. I kept my face level. I had spent 4 years on survey contracts in Sudbury, working alongside GSC field teams. I had read somewhere north of 200 GSC assessment reports across 4 provinces. I knew their classification taxonomy the way I know the make of my own drill. There is no such classification as biologically inert subsurface acoustic resonance. That phrase does not exist in any GSC document I have ever read or heard referenced. It has the right shape. It sounds like the kind of thing a GSC report would say if you'd never read one, if you'd only heard them described secondhand, or if you'd made one up and needed it to sound credible to someone who didn't know better. Justin had looked at my file. He knew I was a Watts contractor out of Sudbury. He knew my survey background. He had looked at all of that and decided the lie was worth trying anyway, which meant one of 2 things. Either he'd been sloppy or he decided that it didn't matter much whether I believed him. I thanked him for the information. I picked up my printout. I walked back to the bunkhouse in the dark with my hands in my pockets and the cold coming up off the access road in a way that cut right through the jacket. And I thought about what it means when a man tells you a lie he knows you might be able to. Check, it means he's not particularly worried about what you'll do next. The decision came together fast, which isn't usually how I work. I'm the kind of person who sits on things, turns them over, checks the angles before I commit. But I walked back from Justin's office that night and the math was already done. A man tells you a lie, he knows you can check. He's not worried about what you'll do next. That's not a situation you want to be in when you're 6 levels underground and the only other person you trusted is missing. I packed one bag, not everything, just what mattered. My survey tablet, the seismic printout folded into the front pocket, a change of clothes, my Watts paperwork, the little envelope of emergency cash I keep in the lining of every bag I own because my dad taught me to do that, and I've never stopped. The rest of it, the extra gear, the second pair of boots, the coffee tin I'd bought at the Nipigon gas station on the drive up. I left where it was. You can replace boots. You can't replace the window where the supply truck stops. I set an alarm for 5:45 and I slept in my clothes. Not a great sleep. Not terrible either, considering I've slept worse in worse places, waiting for worse things. The alarm went off and I was already awake. The parking lot at 5:50 in the morning is one of the lonelier places I've been. The lights over the equipment building throw a flat orange across the gravel, and everything outside that circle is just dark and cold, and the sound of the access road moving in the wind through the spruce. My breath was coming out in a small cloud. I had the bag over one shoulder and I was moving toward my truck, and I was already thinking about the drive, how long to White River, whether I'd stop for gas or push through to Wawa. And then I saw the tires, both of them flat, not slow leak flat, not maybe there's a nail flat, flat in the way that means someone put a tool to them. The sidewalls were sitting on the gravel. I crouched down and put my hand on the rear one, and it was cold and soft and wrong. And I just stayed there for a second with my hand on it because my brain needed a moment to catch up to what my eyes had already told it. I stood up, okay, the satellite phone. There was one working satellite phone on the whole site. The others had been in for repair since early in the contract, which I'd thought was sloppy maintenance and now thought was something else. I'd seen it in the equipment locker the night before when I'd gone to check the seismic array one last time. I remembered it specifically. Black case, yellow rubber bumper around the edges, sitting on the second shelf to the left of the door. I walked to the equipment building. I opened the locker. The shelf was empty. There was a rectangular outline in the dust where the phone had been sitting and nothing else. I stood there looking at that outline for a while. I don't know exactly what I was expecting. I think part of me had still been operating on the assumption that things were bad but not organized, that Justin was covering something up, that the mine had a problem they were managing badly, that David had wandered or gotten hurt or I don't know. Something that was terrible but still accidental. The flat tires I could have talked myself into. Vandalism happens. Gravel lots are hard on sidewalls, but the phone was gone from a locked building and the tires were flat on the one vehicle I had. And the supply truck came at 6 on the dot and didn't wait for anyone. I heard it before I saw it. The engine a long way off on the access road coming through the trees. I walked back out to the lot and stood there with the bag still over my shoulder and watched the headlights come around the bend and then keep going. Didn't slow, didn't pull in. The driver wouldn't have had any reason to. I hadn't flagged anything, hadn't called ahead, hadn't done anything except decide in my own head that I was leaving. The truck just went past and the sound of it faded, and then there was nothing but the wind in the spruce again and the orange light on the gravel and me standing there with flat tires and no phone and nowhere to be. I put the bag down. I sat on it. I'm not proud of that part, just sitting there on my own bag in a parking lot at 6:00 in the morning like I'd missed a bus. But that's what happened. I needed a minute to think, and my legs had apparently decided to take it whether I was ready or not. The thing is, I knew what this meant. Someone had been watching me, or watching my truck, or watching the equipment locker, maybe all three. Justin had looked at me across his desk the night before and decided a fake GSC classification was worth trying, which meant he'd already decided I wasn't going anywhere that mattered. And now here was the proof of it. The tires, the phone, the truck gone past. I wasn't being managed, I was being contained. That's a different thing entirely. I don't know exactly how long I sat there, long enough for the cold to work through my jacket. long enough to go through the options twice and come up empty both times. No vehicle, no phone, no way to flag down the next truck because I didn't know when the next truck was, and I had no way to find out. The nearest town was a long walk on a road I didn't know in weather that didn't care. I was thinking about whether I could get to the surface monitoring station and whether there was a landline, whether there was anything in the equipment building I'd missed, whether Justin was watching me right now from somewhere I couldn't see. The intercom crackled. It's mounted on the side of the equipment building. The shaft intercom, one of those old panel setups with a speaker grill and a push-to-talk button and a row of indicator lights for each level. I'd walked past it every day for weeks without thinking about it, but the sound it made at 6:12 in the morning was not the intercom. It was the beacon channel, a steady pulsing tone coming through the speaker grill and the indicator light for level 7 blinking amber in a slow rhythm. I knew that beacon. I knew it specifically because I'd watched David clip it to the equipment rack on day 2. First thing before we'd even started the survey layout, he'd pulled it out of his kit like it was automatic. The kind of thing a man does without thinking because he's done it enough times that it's just habit. Standard safety measure. You clip the GPS beacon, you check the battery, you move on. I'd watched him do it and then forgotten about it because that's how safety measures work. When nothing goes wrong, you stop seeing them. The beacon had been silent for 14 days. Since the morning David didn't show for muster, I stood up. I walked to the intercom panel and I looked at the light blinking amber and I listened to the tone coming through the speaker. It was steady and even and it didn't say anything. Obviously, it's a beacon, not a radio, but it was transmitting, which meant the beacon was active, which meant one of two things. Either David was alive somewhere near level 7 and the beacon had activated because he was moving, or David had activated it deliberately because he wanted someone to come down. Either way, David was there. I picked up my bag. I thought about Justin telling me about biologically inert subsurface acoustic resonance with a straight face. I thought about the seismic data and the 47-second cycle and the 2 workers from 2019 who were listed as location unknown at time of shift end. I thought about David's hand pressed flat against the tunnel wall, eyes closed, perfectly still. I took the cage elevator down. The cage was already occupied when I got there. That's the part I keep coming back to even now. I'd walked from the parking lot with my bag still over one shoulder, didn't think to drop it. Didn't think about much of anything except the amber light blinking on the intercom panel and what it meant that David's beacon was live after 14 silent days. I came around the corner of the equipment building, pushed through the heavy door into the shaft house, and there was Justin Juarez standing inside the cage with his hands in his jacket pockets, facing the grate, watching me come in, not descending, not waiting for someone to operate the controls, just standing there inside the cage at 10:06 in the morning like he'd been expecting me to show up at exactly that moment. I stopped walking just for a second. My brain did that thing where it tries to make something ordinary out of something that isn't, runs through the explanations, comes up empty, and then you just keep moving because there's nothing else to do. I stepped into the cage. I didn't say anything to him, and he didn't say anything to me. The cage dropped. Level 7 is the deepest active level at Hemlo. The ride down takes a few minutes depending on how many stops the cage makes. And it makes none at that hour because nobody else is underground yet. It's just the cable running and the rock walls sliding past the grate and the lamplight and the pressure in your ears adjusting as you go down. I stood on one side of the cage. Justin stood on the other. The bag was still on my shoulder. I was still in yesterday's clothes. I'd slept in them specifically so I could leave fast, and that had worked out about as well as everything else that morning. I didn't look at him. I watched the shaft wall through the grate and I thought about the seismic data. 47 seconds in, 47 seconds out, 90 seconds from entry to first cycle. Every worker past 4 level 7 entries in 2 weeks either transferred or quit or stopped appearing in the logs entirely. I was on my 6th entry. Justin had known that when he sat across from me in his office and asked if I'd been sleeping well, if I'd felt drawn toward any particular section of the mine. He'd known exactly what he was asking and why. The cage hit level 7, and I pulled the emergency stop cable before the gate was fully open. It's a red-handled cable mounted on the interior wall of the cage, part of the original safety rigging. Yanking it locks the elevator in position, kills the motor signal, engages the brake, holds the cage at whatever level it's sitting on. I'd used one exactly once before, years back in a nickel operation outside Timmons when a guy on my crew cut his hand badly enough that we needed to hold position while we got him stabilized. You pull it and the cage stays put. Nothing rides it up. Nothing rides it down until someone resets it from the surface controls or from inside the cage itself. I pulled it, the cage locked with a sound like a bolt going home. Justin was already moving, not toward me, toward the keypad mounted on the rock wall beside the cage gate. I hadn't noticed that keypad before. Not once in 6 level 7 entries had I seen anyone use it or even look at it. It was set into the wall at about shoulder height, gray housing, a small numeric display across the top, the kind of thing your eyes just slide past because it looks like every other piece of monitoring equipment in a mine. And none of it is your business unless something goes wrong. Justin's fingers were on it before I'd fully processed what I was watching. No hesitation, no squinting at the display, no pulling out a phone to check a code, no pause of any kind. His hand went to the keypad the way your hand goes to a light switch in your own house. Muscle memory, not thought. He was 4 digits into a sequence before I said anything. Stop. He didn't stop. His fingers kept moving. I watched his hand. I counted what I could see of the sequence. 6 digits, maybe 7, entered with the fluency of someone who'd done it enough times that the number lived in his fingers rather than his head. Management level access only. That's what the keypad housing said, actually. There was a small label below the numeric display, black text on yellow, management access, level supervisors only. I'd walked past it a dozen times without reading it. Now I was reading it. He finished the code. The display lit green. I thought about the GSC classification that didn't exist. I thought about him sitting in his office chair, relaxed, telling me about biologically inert subsurface acoustic resonance with a completely straight face. I thought about what it means when someone tells you a lie that only works if you're ignorant of the subject. It means they've assessed you, decided what you know and what you don't, and made a calculation. They've thought about you, they've been thinking about you. He'd been thinking about me since before I arrived. The cage gate was still closed. Justin had one hand on it, the green light still showing on the keypad, and he was about to pull it open. I shoved him. Both hands flat against his chest hard enough that he went back 2 steps and hit the rock wall behind him. He didn't fall. He caught himself, one hand on the wall, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not shocked exactly, something more like recalculation. I stepped back inside the cage, pulled the inner gate shut, got my hand on the descent control. Edwin, his voice was even, no heat in it. You don't know what's down there. I know you do, I said. I reversed the elevator downward. The cage dropped and Justin was gone, and I was alone in the shaft with the rock walls running past the grate and the cable above me in the dark below. My bag was still on my shoulder. I noticed that, didn't do anything about it. I was thinking about the keypad, about how his fingers had moved through that sequence, about how many times a person has to enter a code before it stops being something they remember and starts being something they just do. He'd been down here not just overseeing from above, not just reading reports and running symptom inventories in his office. He'd been down here enough times that the access code was in his hands. The cage slowed and stopped at the bottom of the shaft, level 7, the lowest active level. The drift tunnel where the permanent staff had refused to work and the previous surveyor had paid $4,000 out of pocket to leave behind. I stood in the cage for a moment before I opened the gate. Amber emergency light above the shaft entry was going, painting everything in that flat yellow-orange that makes distances hard to read. The air down here was cooler than the levels above. It smelled like wet rock and old blasting residue and something else underneath that I'd never been able to name exactly. Not bad, just present. The way some rooms have a smell that belongs to them and nothing else. I opened the gate. I stepped out into level 7. The cage sat behind me, locked at this level. Nothing writing it up or down without the reset sequence I didn't have. Justin was above ground with the keypad code, and I was below ground with no phone and a bag over one shoulder. And somewhere in the drift tunnel ahead of me, David Sandoval's beacon. Was still transmitting. I switched on my headlamp. The tunnel opened up in front of me, the beam cutting maybe 30 ft before the dark took over. The walls were rough blasted granite, pale gray and brown, the drill marks still visible in the rock face where the lateral drift had been extended. I'd mapped this tunnel. I knew every turn. I knew exactly how far it went before it dead-ended at the new face. I started walking. The beam from my headlamp cut down the tunnel and found him about 40 ft in. He was standing with his back to me, facing the rock wall at the end of the lateral drift. The new face, the one we'd been mapping together for 3 weeks, both arms loose at his sides, not touching the wall, just standing in front of it the way you'd stand in front of something you were waiting on. His coveralls were dirty at the knees and along one shoulder. And his breathing was audible even from 40 ft back, slow and deliberate and wrong. Not the way a person breathes when they're resting, but the way a person breathes when they're doing something that requires concentration. I felt the vibration start up in my sternum, that low, pressureless thing that wasn't quite sound. It had been quiet since I stepped off the cage. I'd noticed that the absence of it, the way you notice a refrigerator hum only when it stops, now it was back. 47 seconds in, 47 out. I knew the cycle by then. I'd stared at those seismic printouts long enough that the numbers had gotten into me somewhere. David was breathing in time with it, not approximately, not close, exactly. I stood there for a few seconds and watched him and didn't say anything. I was trying to work out whether this was something I'd be able to handle, I guess. Whether what I was looking at was a man in distress or a man in something else entirely. He hadn't moved when my headlamp hit him. Hadn't turned around. Either he didn't hear me come in or he knew I was there and it didn't matter to him yet. David, I said. He turned around. His face was his face. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I try to explain this to myself. I think I was expecting something. I don't know what exactly, something wrong. Something that would tell me immediately that the man standing in front of me wasn't the same man who'd eaten lunch across from me for 3 weeks. And told me about his daughter's hockey leg with the same flat tone he used for everything else. But it was him. Square face, heavy brow, gray-blue eyes that found me in the headlamp beam and tracked me the way a person's eyes track someone they recognize. He looked tired. He looked like he'd been underground for 14 days without a shower, which he had. He looked like David. His eyes stayed on me for a moment. Then he said my name. Edwin, just that, not a question, not surprise, like he was confirming something he'd already known. Yeah, I said, I'm here, are you hurt? He didn't answer that directly. He said, it already knew you'd come back down. I didn't have anything to say to that right away. I stood there with my headlamp on his face and the vibration sitting in my chest and tried to figure out what the right response was. There wasn't one, so I didn't say anything. Then David sat down, not like his legs gave out. There was no stumble, no grab for the wall. It was more like a decision his body made without consulting him. A simple downward movement, and then he was sitting on the tunnel floor with his back against the rock face and his hands loose in his lap and his eyes still on me. Done, that's the only word for it, like a machine that had finished its cycle and powered down to standby. I sat down beside him. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was that I didn't know what else to do. The cage was locked at level 7 behind me and Justin was above ground and I had no phone and no plan beyond find David. And I'd found David, and now I needed a minute to think, but part of it was something else. The seismic data had shown the cycle responded to presence. It started 90 seconds after a person entered the drift and stopped 90 seconds after they left. David had been down here for 14 days, breathing in time with a 47-second vibration cycle. And I'd watched him press his hand against a tunnel wall on day 11 with his eyes closed and his whole body still listening to something I hadn't been able to hear yet. I pressed my hand flat against the rock wall. The surface was cold, rough, blasted granite, unfinished, the drill marks still in it. I'd run my hands over this wall a dozen times in the past 3 weeks, doing survey work, taking measurements, checking the face for stability. I knew the texture of it, but sitting here with my palm flat against it and the vibration in my chest and David next to me breathing slow and even, it felt different. Not threatening, not welcoming either. Present, the way the smell down here was present. Something that had been here a long time and wasn't going anywhere. The vibration cycle, which had paused when I walked into the tunnel. I'd noticed that, too. The way it had dropped out the moment I stepped off the cage and started down the drift resumed. The exact moment my hand touched the wall, I didn't pull my hand back. I don't know why. Probably I should have, but I'd come this far on the logic that running from something I didn't understand wasn't going to help me understand it. And sitting here with my hand on the rock and David next to me seemed like the first honest thing I'd done since I pulled those seismic printouts. We sat there for a while, I'm not sure how long. The vibration moved through the rock and into my palm and up my arm and settled somewhere behind my ribs, and it wasn't painful, wasn't even unpleasant exactly, just constant, attentive. That's the word that kept coming to me, like being watched by something that didn't have eyes. Then I heard the cable. It was faint at first, just a metallic whisper through the shaft above us. The kind of sound you learn to read after enough time underground, cable tension changing, the counterweight shifting. The cage was moving. I'd left it locked at level 7. I'd pulled the emergency stop myself, watched the mechanism engage. Justin was above ground. I hadn't called it down. The sound got louder, descending. David didn't react. He was still breathing in his slow, timed rhythm, hands in his lap, eyes forward. I looked at him and then I looked back toward the tunnel entrance where the shaft was, and I thought about the keypad Justin had used, the one I'd never seen touched before, the one his fingers had moved through without hesitation. Management level access override code. I'd shoved him out of the cage on level 7, but I hadn't disabled the system. Hadn't done anything to the keypad itself. I'd just taken the elevator down and hoped that was enough. It wasn't enough. The cable kept running through the shaft, steady and unhurried, and I sat there with my hand flat against the rock and thought about what Justin was going to find when the cage reached level 7 and the gate opened. He'd find the tunnel entrance. He'd find my headlamp beam somewhere in the dark. He'd find David sitting on the floor, and whatever he was planning to do about all of it, whatever the end of this was from his side, it was on its way down right now. I didn't move. That's what I keep having to explain to people when I tell this. The ones who ask why I didn't run or fight or do something. There was nowhere to run to. The cage was the only way up, and the cage was coming down with Justin on it, and David was sitting next to me breathing in time with something I'd spent 3 weeks trying to name, and my hand was on the wall, and the vibration was in me now the same way it was in him. The same 47-second cycle in and out. And for the first time since day 8, the pressure behind my sternum didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a question. I don't know what it was. I still don't. I've thought about it a lot, and I don't have a clean answer, and I've stopped expecting to find one. What I know is what the data showed. Something down there responded to human presence. Had been responding for years, had been doing something to the people sent into that tunnel that the mine's management knew about and logged and kept sending people into. Anyway, 2 workers from 2019 still listed as location unknown at time of shift end. David Sandoval missing for 14 days and sitting on a tunnel floor, breathing like a metronome. Me on my 6th entry in 11 days. Hand pressed flat against cold granite, listening to a cage descend toward us through the dark. The cable kept running, the vibration kept cycling. David kept breathing. I stayed where I was. Whatever was coming down, I was going to be sitting right here when it arrived. Not because I'd run out of choices, though I had, but because this was the only position that felt honest. I'd come down for David. David was here. My hand was on the wall and something was listening, and I wasn't going to pretend I understood it. I just waited. The cage came down.